Okay, well, welcome everyone to the next in our series of the This Is Your Life seminars. I think they've been pretty interesting so far. I've been enjoying them. This week we have Paul Garrett. Given that Paul's going to spend the next 45 minutes telling us about his life, I probably won't go into any great detail, but Paul and I met at the University of Newcastle, and then he came down for completely other reasons, but is now going to be working in my lab in a very short or very close future. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what the whole journey has been.
Oh, hello everybody. So I wrote this over the weekend. It was quite difficult. I'm an early career researcher, so I don't have an enormous history in academia. But what I do have is quite an interesting story about the things that led me to psychology. So I will tell some things that I don't normally talk about, and they're difficult. But I chose to do this because my supervisor on me would have said, there we go. Tell the truth, tell it simply, and everything after that is bad. And I agree with that. And so I will tell it all. This is my family. My mum was an English immigrant. She came out here when she was 12. My dad, he was the 5th child of 13, naturally Catholic. This is my sister Catherine and Louise, and I'm the eldest of the 3. Because Dad is one of 13, we had a big extended family. These are all my cousins, and this is me down the front in the middle. Now there's well and truly over 100 Garretts in Newcastle, and I literally cannot go outside without running into one of them. Most of them I don't actually know. I grew up in West Wallsend, which is an old coal mining town. It's quite small. It's about 40 minutes out of Newcastle. There's not much to do there. And it was also where I had my first job, which was at the local IGA. Now, being a small town, and I was, a local for 20 years, I knew everybody. Everybody knew me. And that bred into me this idea that you should have a community. You should know everybody. And so I think most people in this room are aware of the fact that I like to say hello. And I like to know everybody's names and everybody's business. And I feel like it started here. The other thing about small country towns is rumors. Everybody likes to have a story about somebody else. So my story, entirely fabricated, was that I was the love child of one of my bosses, come to claim the inheritance of the IGA. And for some reason, this perpetuated around town. And to this day, they still think that I mixed on just a bit of fun. So my beginnings in psychology. So my career started about here. Well, actually, about here. You see, when I was 5 weeks old, I was a relatively healthy child, and then I started crying. And then I didn't stop crying for 3 days. It turned out that I had a bowel infection. That's where the small intestine goes in the large intestine and twist. Right? So I was in agony for 3 days. The doctors figured it out, and now I have a lovely scar across my tummy where they fixed me up. Now this, in the scheme of things, isn't too important. I grew up healthy as a toddler with a shock of curly hair, and then I grew into a teenager with a shock of curly hair. But the thing that this experience did was that it changed my pain tolerance. So from about after 5 years old, I experienced pain in almost a binary fashion. So I would always over respond if I was hurt, or I'd be entirely fine. And it wasn't until much later that the doctors and psychologists thought that it was related to this. that I had to relearn what pain tolerances were, basically from that 3-day window, which I'm not sure if it's true. It's just interesting. And when that was kind of put to me, was one of those first times that I thought the brain and the body and their interaction was really fascinating. So, moving forward, healthy kid, happy kid, fulfill my lifelong goal of becoming Paul the Postman, with my best friend Daniel the dentist, and things were good right up until about year 5. In year 5, I started to struggle a lot with school, much more than I thought was normal. And it turns out it's because I thought English is dumb. None of this makes any sense. And the reason I thought that was because I couldn't spell at all. Like I could get maybe 3 words in 100. And we're talking like dog. Like I couldn't grasp spelling. And I also couldn't read. And this became a serious problem. What it meant was that I started having severe anxiety about going to school because I couldn't do any of the work. I could do maths and I could do a lot of science because I just remembered facts, but I couldn't do anything that involved writing. And this anxiety manifested in having stomach pains. And so I became like cheap. Everything that was anxiety provoking resulted in a stomach pain. And so I started missing time from school. Whenever there was a spelling test or anything to do with, essays, all that kind of stuff. And this got so severe that by year 7, I was missing like 1 every 2 days, and eventually just stopped going. So, what this did for me is kind of ironic. Because I wasn't going to school, I had to learn how to read. And so I taught myself how to read out of textbooks. And that was my education for most of year 6 to year 8. And then I discovered that I really needed a teacher. I couldn't do everything out of a textbook anymore. And then things started to get worse for my health. I started having some seizures and stuff, and I ended up in hospital. And that was where I had my first experience with mirror imaging. And I thought this was the coolest. This is like the frontier. This is where science is. And I wanted to do that, right? The other thing that happened was the doctors found nothing physically wrong with me. And they figured it was psychosomatic, which it was. And so I started seeing a clinical psychologist. I met Ben. Now, Ben was everything I wanted to be. He had all the answers. He knew how to relieve my anxiety, how to do behavioral strategies to get around that. He understood my childhood with the bowel stuff. It was great. And with his help, I got back to school, back to normal. Things were back on track. And from that point, I thought, I want to be a clinical psychologist. And that was my direction. So, into Newcastle. I got to, university, enrolled in psychology. Well, everything's on track. This is where I met a number of important people for my career, including Patrick Cooper, Scott and Army, so Scott Brown and Army Eagles, and Simon. From the outside looking in, again, this is without context, my undergrad took about 6 years, and in that time I worked in the functional neuroimaging lab, where I worked with Freeman Harriandis, and I did neuroimaging, so EEG, fMRI, and of course I did that because I had this love of neuroimaging. I thought it was the coolest thing in the world. What I soon discovered though was that imaging wasn't really giving a lot of answers. This was a massive study that we were performing, and there weren't a lot of results that were tangible. And so I started looking at the response times from a task switching task that we ran. And I found, well, just weird quirks in the data. So the task was you saw a stimulus wheel, and you either had to respond to the letter, the digit, or the color. You were cued, and in the queue, it would say it's either informative, so it's definitely going to be a letter task, or it would be uninformative, it would be a letter or a color task. So depending on where the stimulus falls in the wheel. And what this made was for different kinds of levels of information task. So we had informative cues, non-informative cues. We had repeat trials where it was the same position, switch trials. And the response time distributions were kind of all over the place. We also had distracted trials. So this is a big task. And I couldn't figure out what was making the response times, the mean response times, vary so much. And we took this to a conference, and I met Marcelo Packer, and he's a Spanish neuroscientist. And he just looked at this and went, information theory. But that's what we need to do. And so that's where I started information theory. We figured out a nice way of quantifying the cue, the target, the response, based on how much information it was providing the system. And as soon as we did that, we got these lovely results that showed a linear trend with response time and the amount of uncertainty in the system. I thought that was really cool. So I did this for 11 other papers that I found their mean response times and quantified their information, and I got the exact same results. I thought, this is it. I've done it. Get rid of this mirror imaging stuff. It's response times, that's where it's at. And so that was where my love for cognitive science and response time modeling started. So this is from the outside looking in. From the inside looking out, it was a lot different. And that's why context is everything. So from the inside looking out, my first year undergrad was pretty normal, everybody else. My second year, my bands that I was in fell apart, and I lost a close friend of mine to an overdose, and that was really, really tragic. And it seriously hampered my ability to do work. The next year, I was refereeing, and I had swelling in my abdomen. And so I went and saw the doctor, and through a series of biopsies, they couldn't decide if it was cancerous. And so I went on some pretty extreme autoimmune suppressors, and that resolved the problem. But for about 6 to 8 months, I was just free. And so I was still doing university at the time, and my grades just flunked. Context is everything. Next year, I met my partner Zoe. Best thing in my life, by far. I don't talk about Zoe much in this talk, but the best way of describing her is she's the space between all the words. Without her, nothing else makes sense. This is the same time that I started work in the mirror imaging line. And so things changed a lot at that stage. And then, I was doing neuroimaging, finding my love for research, and then my life took another bit of a swing, and my mum got sick. So my mum got stage 4 brain cancer. And so she had to have surgery on her temporal lobe. Her memory was severely impacted. Her ability to walk and talk was also impacted for a while. And so I just dropped out of uni. I just stopped. I couldn't keep on doing this emotional labor. And so I worked in the lab, and at nights I would go home and I took my mum. She couldn't be awake through the daytime because of the photosensitivity from the surgeries, and I would rehabilitate her. And so that was my day in, day out. And that really changed how I felt about doing clinical work, because I didn't feel like I could keep on doing this kind of work. A lifetime of this seemed really, really hard. And so I just put that aside and I focused on my research. And that was the context by which this paper came out. That was me refocusing where I wanted to go with my career. And it would be really easy to just show you this one slide and say that's where I started. that wouldn't be true. And I know it's not comfortable, but I kind of figured that's what this talk is about. The truth, the context. So my marks, of course, were not great. And I started my honours year. And by a quirk of the system, if you didn't get a good enough mark to do a standalone honours project, that year you could do a group project. So I joined a group of 3 other people. None of them were interested in research. None of them were interested in cognitive science. They all wanted to be clinicians, and they thought that basically math was dumb, and that was fine. I worked with it. And Armin took me under his wing and said, "What do you want to do?" And I wasn't really sure, and he suggested looking at numbers. And so he has this thing called system factorial technology, a way of looking at parallel and serial processing, and a way of looking at processing efficiency. And so that's where I moved into. And so I looked at enumeration. So here, whether you can split an item set into colors, and then how you quantify their values, whether it's in serial, or whether you do this at the same time in parallel. This really started a love for me of SFT and non-parametric techniques, and I adored everything I learned this year. What it actually meant in reality was I learnt Python in my honours year. I programmed my own experiment because the school programmer was quite overwhelmed with all these group projects and individual honours projects. So I taught myself Python. The actual task was very, very basic. Just a couple of dots, a mask, and was this less than the criteria? That was it. Nothing fancy. The following on from this, I had to learn MATLAB, and so I programmed my analysis looking at SICs, these lovely squiggles, and these are diagnostic criteria for parallel versus serial processing. And so my honours year was quite intense, but I learned a lot, like an enormous amount, and it really set me up to do a PhD. And so what it meant was, by the time I was doing a PhD, I was well and truly ahead of the curve, and that made things a lot easier in the long run. And it also meant that I was able to take on other projects on the side, and that's basically how I met Simon. The other thing that happened was nothing worked. All my results, nothing happened. And Ami said, "Don't worry, I'll take you on as a PhD student anyway." And these were the reasons. He said, because you're kind, because you love research, these things make you a good academic. And I agree entirely. I don't think grades tell you anything about an academic. I don't think undergrad really tells you much about an academic. I think what makes you good is your willingness to work with other people, treat them well, and your passion. If you don't have those things, nothing else matters. You can be the smartest person in the world. No one wants to work with you. You know, so these are what, to me, make a good academic. So I started my PhD. I did the thing that I wanted to do in the first place, because now I had the skills. So I looked at item sets, different colors, and how we pass this stuff out. I looked at, I controlled for things like the area and the density of the dots. And I tried to do this as psychophysically as possible, trying to control for everything. And what I found was that people do process items, so be it in estimation, so large item sets, or subitizing very small item sets in parallel. But they do this slower than if they do it in serial. What this meant was that whenever there's another item set, let's distractingly, you're much, much slower. So then it's interference with the system. In other words, context is everything. The other thing that happened was I took this work and I showcased it in Indiana University to Jim Townsend, who was the originator for systems factorial technology and also the crossover point for Simon at Bloomington, Charles Bloomington. Oh, who else is Bloomington? Sorry? Dan. Dan. Of course, the person on the slide. Yeah, and so, you know, I met Jim, I met Dan, and we did a series of investigations looking at different mathematical derivatives of the SIC. And what it really led to was our latest paper, a show about nothing. Now, again, context. A show about nothing is usually in reference to Seinfeld. And there's no one who loves Seinfeld more than RBS. He has a TV in his house, and it's for two things: the Olympics and Seinfeld. That's it. So, yes, he is very proud of his title. And basically what we found was under normal processing efficiency models for the capacity coefficient, we look at processing for a stimulus in one location and another location, and we compare that to when they're presented together, right? And if you take the division, you get a measure of processing efficiency, how much faster or slower you are at seeing two dots together as opposed to each in isolation. Under the normal self-terminating or minimum time formula for this, everything works out fine. As soon as you start doing the exhaustive model, the exhaustive equation, things start to get a bit wonky. The problem is that people stop looking at the dot, they start looking at the absence. And that severely changes all of your predictions. So under the old AND model, we saw that processing efficiency just went onwards, where under the self-terminating with the blue line, everything was stable. And so we came up with a new task, a full identification task. You had to respond to the location of the dot and not the stimulus itself. So you have to kind of respond to a separate key for this top and a separate key for this bottom. And as soon as you do that, you can derive a new equation and you get this lovely green line, and your predictions all make sense again. And so that was kind of another example of where context is everything. The absence of a stimulus is as important as the stimulus itself. So backing up a step, the other thing I did in Newcastle was unforgettable. I still love math and still make people cry. That's fine. I used to wander around with this camera around my neck that this madman called Simon Dennis convinced me was a good idea. And I would record data, and we started doing a series of papers looking at how memory changes with real-world data. And I thought this was just groundbreaking. Everything I wrote about up until this point was done in a lab. Every memory task was like basically going through cards, right? And all of a sudden we're doing memory for the day of the week, you know, the hour, where you were in the classroom, phenomenal. And it led to a lot of work. It led to a paper where we're looking at hierarchical models for this, and that introduced me to hierarchical dates. We looked at dependencies among different timescales, and that was work led by Xiang Wook, who used to be here. And he was one of my closest friends back in Newcastle. Amazing academic. Privacy versus open science. This topic in particular, so this is specifically about the unforgettable system and about how you can collect data and retain people's privacy while also being able to analyze that data en masse. I think Simon could explain it a lot better, but this privacy paper really started a lot for me of understanding what it is that people are concerned about, right? You can ask someone whether they're willing to give you their phone numbers, say to go to a restaurant, like COVID, and they're more than happy to. But as soon as you put that online, the equation suddenly changes. They're concerned about who has the data. Your date of birth, very, very important. Something that should be very, very private. You can use in a range of things. But people are often very willing to put that information down in different sites. So this privacy calculus was kind of originated for me in this paper. And I thought it was really fascinating. The last thing that all this led to was a love for experience sampling data. And when I came here to the University of Melbourne in 2019, I started working with Elisa Calabrinos, who of course I met back in Newcastle. And she was doing work on experience sampling in motion regulation. And so on the side, so again, on the side, I was doing work with the police. And here we looked at whether people, if they're motivated, are able to regulate their emotions better. And we found, yes, it's a big factor in whether people successfully do it. And that all comes from, again, real world data. And again, context. The last thing. Last year, I did a postdoc with Simon, but also with Andy, Yoshi, and Dan, and we did a project led by Simon and Stephen Ladowski, looking at people's attitudes towards different COVID-19 tracking technologies. This is kind of the culmination of a few things for me. This is the privacy aspect, whether people are willing to give up their data and why. This is a culmination to my modeling work. So I had to do Bayesian models with this data, and most recently some mixed models using Bayesian processes. And it really pushed me, both physically and mentally. And Simon knows there were some days where I was doing like 36-hour stints to get the data as quickly as possible and output it, because we're giving this to the Australian government to inform their cabinet meetings. So it was an intense year, but really interesting. And it resulted in papers in Taiwan, the UK, Australia, and Germany. So that kept me busy last year. And an international paper across 10 countries, which I'm still trying to finish. And the thing that I think is most interesting from these findings is that we looked at acceptance for the different contact tracing apps like COVID-Safe, and we looked at actual downloads of these apps. What we found is that acceptance is much, much, much higher than actual downloads. And again, when we start to model this data, you see it's things like privacy, security, and perceived government effectiveness. These are the things that are predictive of whether people will actually use the data, even if they said that they were accepting it. So again, context around the data that you're collecting, working on, that's everything. So, in sum, this is me. I'm Paul. I've done a lot of different things. I didn't go through all the research that I've done. This year, I'm working with Simon on a different postdoc, looking at experience sampling data and boundaries with which we separate numbers. I'm also working with Phil Smith, looking at psychophysical work, returning to my roots. I'm really excited about this. But I also want to take a second to acknowledge a few things. This is talk about context being everything, but it's also a bit about privilege, right? I got a lot of opportunities. A lot of things went wrong. At every step that things went wrong, if I were a different person, that could have just ended my career, right? I'm very fortunate. Luck, and fortune play a big role. It's important that people keep this in mind and work to make opportunities for people who are less fortunate. That's a big part of what I do. And the last thing is the kindness. And in the origins of this talk, I wanted to write it as kindness is everything, but I thought it would make much sense with that. So yeah, this is my fundamental belief. I don't really have religion, I don't really have faith. I believe in kindness and looking after people. That's what I strive to do. So to that extent, I'd like to say a big thank you to the people who have been very, very kind to me over the years. Some of which are here, all of which are in this room. And many, many which are in neither. Yeah, I wouldn't be doing the stuff I am today without basically everyone. And so these are the last things that I'll leave you with. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
Maybe I'll kind of, while people are kind of playing, I'll give my little anecdote. Because I remember seeing Paul when his group gave the presentation in his honours year, and it was just the most amazing thing because nominally these were all of the students who were not performing, and Paul was giving this presentation. It's just the difference was just so stark. So at one point Paul said, "Oh, I want to hear level." And what it really struck me at the time is like, how does this come to be? Right? How do we, have a student normally in our as well group who can go through the SFT derivations over the weekend. So I think it's an important lesson, right? So as you said before, be real careful about how you treat the metrics, because there's a lot of factors that go into those metrics, and you need to pay attention and continue to think one-on-one.
It's a big issue of mine in the system that from like an honours or a research background based on marks. But I don't really think it's very good.
I know you've been thinking about what yours tell us about that how we
so for the people on Zoom, Charles is asking about a group that I'm working on in the background called PICAN. It's an early career academic group for people in psychology. Just to talk a little bit about that. As I said in the talk, one of what I do is about community and about building relationships with kind of people. And so PICAN was something that, as I talked to early career researchers in the school, especially over COVID, I realized that a lot of them were very, very isolated. A lot of them didn't know how to progress towards being they didn't know what grants they should be going for. They didn't know really a host of things. They didn't know who each other were. So I think I knew maybe 5 or 6 other ECRs in school. It turns out there's about 25, 26, and that's a problem. I know that in years gone by, there was an early career research group in the school, that seems to have crumbled away. And so I spent some time early this year between postdoc positions, talking to all the hub coordinators who, again, I was friends with, so Lauren and Marissa, Lissa, and Michael Diamond, and getting a list of all of the ECRs in the school and all the young teachers, stuff, and trying to connect them up and give them a sense of community. And so that's what became and the school's been really good about it. They've offered to give us a budget, and I was fortunate to get the Friends of Psychology Award that helped fund some workshops and conferences with the group. Yeah, that's where all that started.
But I mean, how you think about it was on how you think about allocating the time
Oh, it's very difficult. So my rule of thumb is work on whatever's closest to being done. It's usually the thing that I don't want to work at. Typically, the task that's 95% of the way done, that last 5% takes 95% again. That's at least my experience with research and papers. That's the way I handle it is, well, if I'm honest, working ridiculous hours for a while. That was my PhD experience, trying to get in unforgettable, as well as SMT. There's a whole other task that I didn't talk about here, which is a very big investigation. There was stuff on modeling SICs and mixed models. There was stuff on cross-cultural representations of number, and looking at how those representations differed between English-speaking Australians and Chinese-speaking people in Taiwan. Yeah, there's been a lot to juggle. And yeah, I think generally the only thing I can say is I just work on what's and try to make sure that I'm prioritizing the people who are looking up. So if say I'm working for Simon's work is what I focus on. Philip's work I focus on. And then if there are things in the background that I'm interested in, like currently I'm talking to Jason about a small Pokemon experiment that I would like to run. Then that's kind of in the evening or on the weekend thing. I'm very fortunate in that research isn't just a job for me. It's kind of a fun hobby that I do on the side. And so, learning some weird neural net on the weekends to make a Pokemon representation is fun. But I know that's not the experience of most people. And I don't expect other people to try and keep up to that kind of output. It's not easy. And so yeah, that's how I do my thing. I try and support any kind of lifestyle that involves research, among other PhDs coming through. Whether they want to work every single day, 24/7, or just 9 to 5, or some other arrangement.
academic question rather than the last capacity costs, which is always the case, or are there some there are some boundaries.
So mathematically, I think the way that we approach this was there's always cost. So even if you're doing a self-terminating search and there's a negative space and stimulus, and when you see the stimulus on, the presence of empty space is still technically cost, and mathematically you need to account for that. But in terms of the formula that you saw on the screen, that washes out when we start doing the derivations. The boundary conditions are basically the logical rule. As soon as you start doing the exhaustive rule, then you have the boundary conditions. I think better modeling would be looking at issues.
So then, associated with making an absolute judgment implies that
So yes, and I'm not sure about the definition for one. So we really only restricted this to technical detection basically. Other conditions that I've done work on with smart gears on word processing and about how that changes. So the prefix of a word, this is suffix of a word, and how that works as parallel to with all those conditions, they're predicated on the information being there, and so you can't account for that. So I'm not really sure if there are other conditions where it applies.
it's still my intuition. Absence of that kind of cost is carried out.
I'm still there.
Thank you very much.